Detective Constable Mark Hopkins' 30-year police career was completely derailed and everything he had previously done right completely erased after being jailed for 4 years. Now, Mark and his wife Tina Burton had made a decision to end their marriage after years together, and in order to repay her husband back after going through a divorce that was described as bitter, acrimonious and insufferable, Tina Burton took off the gloves and she marched right up to the police station and revealed some very serious allegations. Tina told police officers that her ex-husband, their trusted colleague, was corrupt, bent. Rather than having integrity, Mark Hopkins had taken bribes for financial gain, and to make matters worse, she saw him come home with a gleeful smile on his face, beaming, as he walks into the kitchen and stuffed a wad of cash into the kitchen cupboard. Now, Tina Burton went on to further say that Mark was actually boasting about the fact that he had been given money to ensure that a teenage victim whom had been struck with a bat repeatedly would drop the case. Mark had no empathy for his victims of the crimes he investigated. Now, Tina had sat on this information for at least 10 years before deciding to reveal the truth after their divorce. So, in a roundabout way, she kind of enabled his bad actions. And as for the police officer Mark Hopkins, he was not the officer that he portrayed and claimed to be. Now, the merits of a police officer are said to be integrity, honesty, a want to actually help the community and ensure your patch is protected from criminals, gangsters and crime bosses. You are supposed to have patience and an understanding towards your victims, show empathy. Now, on the surface, that was Tony Paddy Detective Constable Mark Hopkins. Mark was said to have had over 30 years experience in the force and was an exemplary officer. However, Mark, who worked for the South Wales Police and instrumental in a number of police scoring convictions, Mark was a walking red flag that had been ignored. The police officer was as corrupt as they came, plain and simple. If a criminal was able to offer cash payments, then Mark was actually the type of person to let them get away with any crimes. It did not matter if the victim was a man, woman, or even teenager. Mark was in the business of tarnishing a police investigation if the money was right. Gluttony, greed, ego, and a crass perception of victims helped to decay Mark's moral compass. Detective Chief Constable Richard Lewis says that DC Mark Hopkins' actions had seriously destroyed the trust South Wales Police and public had in him as an officer. So, Mark was the lead police officer investigating a crime where 17-year-old Richard Diaper had been targeted by a group of men. Richard had gone to the garage in Ivor Hall petrol station and withdrew a wad of cash from the cash machine. While his back was turned, Richard had been ambushed by a group of men. A baseball bat was used to wallop Richard round the head. Now, Richard fell forward into the cash point and then crumbled backwards to the ground. The gang of men who were masked then continued to pummel and strike the 17-year-old teenager again and again and again and again and again in what was believed to be a case of mistaken identity involving an alleged unpaid debt over dr. Richard, being a 1 victim and 2 a civilian, reported the incident to the police. Initially, police officer Mark Hopkins had done his job. He had vested interest in the crime and proceeded to make necessary steps to investigate, such as acquiring nearby CCTV, taking witness statements, canvassing the area for clues and potential evidence, until Mark eventually came across the gang responsible, or someone linked to the gang, and that would be the petrol station owner. Initially, 5 men connected to the ambush were arrested, but then Mark's ex-wife Tina Burton, while they were still married, had seen Mark walk into the kitchen with a wad of cash, and he had between £500 to £1,000, and he put it on the kitchen table, and he was laughing and smiling to himself. Now, after the GBH incident, Richard began to receive over a dozen phone calls from an unknown number and person. The stranger had promised Richard on the phone that they would be hurt worse than before if he did not retract his statement and tell police he no longer wanted the incident investigated. The gruff voice then explained that he was part of a Manchester gang. The Manchester gangster finished the call by warning Richard that he did not know who he was messing with, so take £3,000 that they were offering and let's move on. Then 17-year-old Richard Diaper went back to the investigating police officer. That would be Mark Hopkins. Richard was a wreck, and he told the officer that he believed his life was in danger, and some Manchester underworld gangsters have told him to retract my statements. Rather than take notes and add new information to the investigation file, Mark just nodded his head before downplaying the nature of the threatening calls, putting it down to either prank calls or nothing more than bravado from a busybody. Mark then allegedly told Richard that he should just take the money, as it would take a long time for the case to get to court. And now that Mark had been paid to impede the investigation, Mark had invited himself over to Richard's home while off duty. Now, while at the victim's home, Mark Hopkins allegedly tried to get Richard to retract his statement further and close the case. On Mark Hopkins' recommendation, Richard begrudgingly closed the case, and it has to be said he also did take the £3,000 that had been offered. Now remember this incident happened in 2008, and at the time, as I said, 5 men linked to the garage were arrested on suspicion of GBH, but of course they were then let go with no further action once Richard Diaper withdrew his statement and then signed a form bringing the investigation to an end. Now the police officer Mark Hopkins continued in his role as a police officer and then worked his way up to a detective constable. Mark had it all: a high-paying role, a good pension, job security, and a marriage, and his own home. However, in 2014, Mark's marriage to his wife Tina Burton had crumbled after 13 years together. The couple had gone from love and acceptance to bitter rivals, trying to get one up on each other. And Mark Hopkins' ex-wife Tina had come to despise Mark so much that in 2014, 6 years after the incident, Tina Burton had made her way to the police station and then told police officers that Mark, their colleague, had been accepting bribes and had come home with the wad of cash. The allegation stated that Mark Hopkins had been paid in excess of £5,000 in order to ruin the investigation. Now, Tina explained that when she questioned Mark as to where the money came from, Mark allegedly says that the garage owner was willing to pay a lot of money to have the case dropped. Mark refuted Tina's allegations when interviewed and called her bitter and explained that Tina was fully invested in a smear campaign against him after the relationship had ended acrimoniously. When Mark was interviewed, he also told his colleagues Tina Burton would often tell him after they were divorced, "I'm going to get you and your corrupt police friends. I'm going to have all your jobs." Mark said that he had discussed the case with Tina, and that was the only morsels of him being infuriated that Richard withdrew his statement. Now, the court had previously heard evidence from Tina Burton that the owner of the garage in question was actually friends with one of Mark Hopkins' colleagues, and that was Detective Constable Phil Simmons. She says that Phil Simmons had told Mark Hopkins that if he persuaded the victim to withdraw his statement, there would be substantial amounts of money that would come their way for the 3 of them. And of course, Mark Hopkins' eyes beamed at the prospect of making more money. And in court, Tina actually took the stand to tell the jury that her ex-boyfriend had come home with a wad of cash, which he kept in a kitchen cupboard. Now, in the interview, Mark Hopkins was forced to admit that he made a catalogue of errors in the investigation and had behaved poorly, as Mark had not confiscated the witness and the victim's clothing as part of evidence and had not followed orders to seize the witness's phones. Mark says despite the errors, he did not take any money from a single person, and ultimately he was not corrupt. However, at Cardiff Crown Court, Mark was found guilty of public office offences and was jailed for 4 years. In his closing statement, the judge says, "You had an unblemished record as a police officer, and that makes it all the more astonishing you were corrupted in this way. Your actions were cynical and motivated by greed alone, and you have shown little remorse." Now, following the 4-year jail sentence, South Wales Police says that Hopkins' conduct represented an appalling example of police corruption. Not only did DC Hopkins let down the victim of a serious incident, but also the communities that he served and his colleagues. Now, Mark's going to face allegations of gross misconduct, and an application will be made to consider forfeiting his pension, which would be met with an applause. When Mark Hopkins was jailed for 4 years and he heard his sentence be read out in court, it was said that he had bowed his head and was completely stunned to silence. Of course, we all know that he's going to have a hard time in jail. Now, does the crime match the sentence? Let me know. Stay safe.